Yeah, so today's topic, as you all know, is on shared values and kindful speech. And it was interesting because we just got a taxi here. And on the way, we had the most wonderful conversation with the taxi driver on exactly that theme without actually mentioning that that was what we were going to be doing today. And it just happened so spontaneously. It was lovely. And I can't remember exactly how it started, but we were talking in general terms. He was obviously very kind. And then at one point, he said, kind of how do we express our values in the world? And I said, well, it's about love. And he said, yeah, but that's not what people do, is it? People don't have love. And I said, well, actually, it's about what we put out as well. Because if we express our values of kindness and love, we'll probably find that those values in the world increase. And he started to get really interested. And he's like, yes, yes, that's really true. And we had the most wonderful conversation to the point that he said it was the best taxi ride he'd ever had. And I think for me as well. But it was really special. And one of the things he said as well was that his mom always used to say, it doesn't matter what race you are, what gender you are, who you are. Actually, we're made differently in order to ponder, in order to learn, in other words, in order to learn from each other and to connect through our common values. Because ultimately, all beings want the same. We want freedom from suffering. We want our own happiness and hopefully the happiness of others too. Sometimes we might be confused about how that comes about. But basically, all human beings do try their best to find happiness. And this is what makes us human and makes it possible to connect not only with other people, but also with other beings who live and who we share this world with. And the differences can, if we are able to embrace them, can really enrich our lives. So today I wanted to talk about this theme and also about how speech can inform our values, how we can use speech to express our values, but also to help other people to develop theirs, or perhaps to encourage ourselves as well. And yeah, it plays a vital role. Kind speech, shared values play a fundamental role in establishing healthy relationships, healthy communities, and healthy societies, and also in keeping our religions on track. There's a lovely story in one of Ajahn Brahm's books. I just call it the toilet story because he loves toilet stories, but it's actually called Understanding the Difference Between the Contents and the Container. And it's this story about how at some point, it must be many years ago, a big argument broke out in Guantanamo Bay when one of the prison guards flushed a holy book down the toilet. I don't know whose holy book that was, which religion's holy book that was, but there were riots on the street following that because it was seen as so disrespectful and so divisive and inflammatory. Such a terrible thing to do. And a journalist approached my teacher, Ajahn Brahm, who's a Buddhist monk in Australia, and he said, well, what would you do? He's asking all the leading religious leaders in Australia, what would they do if their holy books were flushed down the toilet? And Ajahn Brahm answered very promptly. He said, if someone flushed my holy books down the toilet, I'd call a plumber, sir. And then he went on to explain further that you can flush the books down the toilet, but it doesn't matter. The books are just the container. They're not the contents of the religion. The contents are our values. The contents are the kindness, the compassion, the meaning of that religion. And you can never flush those things down the toilet. The only way that you flush that down the toilet is when you also become violent and start to act in ways that go against the basic values of whatever the religion teaches. And I would say that most religions, I would hope all religions, teach kindness, teach harmlessness, teach principles of truth. And he said, it's only, if you actually respond with violence, you're flushing the whole religion down the toilet. So he made this really beautiful point that there's a difference between the container and the contents. And that's what we're talking about today, about the values that we share. And that is in essence the contents. Maybe it's the contents of our mind also, it's the contents sometimes of our speech, but it is also a principle that kind of guides our life's direction. And I want to talk about obviously refining our values and how we can bring our values more in alignment with ethics. Yeah. So, in a way, we could talk about shared ethical values. And ethics in Buddhism runs along the principles of non harm. Basically, anything that protects ourselves and other beings from harm, the kind of harm we wouldn't wish upon ourselves, is ethical behavior. And any behavior that harms another person, especially behavior motivated by greed, hate, and delusion, is unethical behavior. It leads to more suffering and it leads to an erosion of community and social harmony. Yeah. So the Buddha said that when we abstain from breaking any one of the 5 precepts, does everybody know what the 5 precepts are? Yes? Anyone doesn't know? Okay, so not to kill, steal, have sexual misconduct, lie, etc. It's not only lying in wrong speech. I'll get into that. And also taking alcohol and drugs that basically cloud the mind and cause heedlessness. So he says one that abstains from any of those unwholesome actions gives to an immeasurable number of beings freedom from fear, from enmity, and from affliction, and in turn enjoys immeasurable freedom from fear, enmity, and affliction. I was thinking about this and reflecting that sometimes we don't actually realize that we're free from these things when we have more or less ethical leaders. I mean, try and find a fully ethical politician might be difficult, but at least most leaders, we hope, are well-intentioned and try to adhere to a basic code of ethics. And so we do live in relative safety. And when you see some very unethical leaders in this world, the amount of harm that can be inflicted is just, horrific and uncountable. And it can go on for generations. There's something called intergenerational trauma. It's not only the genocides that are happening, the mass starvation that's happening because of corrupt political leadership. It's also, a generational thing. So it really is an immeasurable number of beings that are harmed when we do break these precepts. So we need to learn to bring our values in line with our ethics. And one of the ways to do that is to learn to speak kindly, learn to speak truthfully in ways that bring people together, in ways that don't divide this group of people from that actually promote harmony, rejoice in harmony, and promote those principles, our deepest ethical values, if you like. So speech is one of the clearest and most direct ways that our values become expressed, that they become visible in life. And the basic kind of guideline, and I'm going to get into this more, this is just the introduction, but the basic guideline is to abstain from lying, so false speech, from malicious speech, from harsh speech, and from gossip. In other words, useless speech that doesn't really serve anybody, that wastes a lot of time, the kind of speech that happens just because you want to fill in a gap or you don't really trust the silence sometimes. So we fill it in with all kinds of useless speech. And on the positive side of that, of course, that means adhering to speech which is truthful, which rather than being harsh is gentle, which rather than being malicious actually brings people together, tries to understand, tries to promote harmony, gives people the benefit of the doubt. And speech that's meaningful, speech that the Buddha said is worth recording, it's worth remembering. It's the kind of speech that uplifts our mind. And the best kind of speech actually is speech that talks about the Dhamma and that encourages other people to practice the Dhamma, to live wholesome, ethical lives, and also speech which embodies our values. Yeah. So the Buddha talked about speech that praises simplicity. Even in the car, the taxi driver, he wasn't too worried whether you came out and paid him or not, actually. He said, oh, money's not important. That was his conclusion. Love is important. So we praise living simply. We praise contentment, wanting little, being satisfied with little. instead of, talking about wanting more and more and more and what someone else has and how I want what they have. And goodness me, it's never enough. It's never enough. So one of the reasons it's so important to develop strong, healthy, harmonious communities where we can share wholesome values and encourage each other to live ethical lives is because we need safe places to practice. We can't practice if we feel unsafe. If we don't have a sense of belonging, we're worried whether we fit in, whether we're really seen, whether we're really valued. And sometimes we just feel downright unsafe. And the Buddha said again and again, that the Dhamma will flourish where there is harmonious and healthy community. That's why he created the monastic Sangha and also the lay community, the fourfold assembly is how he described it. When you have well-practicing people of every gender, it was spoken about in binary terms, but it was meant to be an umbrella term to include all beings. Everybody who has little dust in their eyes and who is capable of practicing came under that umbrella, whether you were ordained or not, whatever kind of livelihood you had, you can make that in alignment with your values, and you can actually experience what the Buddha himself experienced. It's possible to be enlightened in this very life, as long as we can pull together. And he also talked about what makes a community harmonious. So he talked about 6 principles of cordiality, and it always involves sharing things in common. So firstly, it's the kind of community where we share views in common. That doesn't mean political ideologies or kind of dogmatic views that we hold true, but the simple view that all beings want happiness and recoil from pain. All beings desire their own happiness. And just as someone else would be very upset, just as I would be very upset if somebody tried to harm someone that's dear to me, so other people will be extremely upset if we harm people who are dear to them or if we try to take their life. So we have to reflect in this way. This is part of right view, basically trying to understand life in terms of what leads to suffering and what leads to freedom from suffering, to peace, to happiness, to harmony inside. And these principles are universal. So there are such things as shared truths. And another shared value that he said conduces to harmony, is essential to harmony in community and society, is sharing virtues in common. Yeah, which we've already discussed to some extent. The next one is sharing our food, which really means, he was talking to monastics, so he said, don't eat a single meal without sharing it with someone else. Okay, so I'll see whatever leftovers I can share today. If it looks attractive, I don't know. But the basic idea is that we share the resources that we have. Yeah, so if you earn a lot, maybe pay more in taxes. If you earn a little, maybe pay less, If you earn more, give more donations. It's not about being more generous. Maybe you have more to give, Sometimes people say, wow, this person gave £300. That's so generous. But maybe the person who gave 5 was actually more generous because they didn't have very much, right? It was harder for them. So we share what we can to make equitable societies where everybody's needs, basic needs, are covered and met. And then the next 3 are very interesting. They're thoughts, words, and deeds. That's 3. Which come from a mind of loving kindness. So loving kindness in thought, word, and deed. So we speak with loving kindness, not only in public, but in private, which again relates to abstaining from divisive speech, speaking words that actually put people in a good light, that help us to see the beauty in one another, because whatever we see in ourselves is what we kind of reflect back, what we're able to bring out. And if we regard other people in a positive way, they tend to start regarding themselves that way. I know for myself, with my own teacher, he always regards me with a sense of very deep trust and, to my amazement, respect, even though I would think the respect should be flowing mainly that way. From him, the respect flows in every direction because he sees every human being's potential for awakening. And that helps me see my own. Even at times that I may be going through some difficulties, there's always something that's difficult as a, pioneer in a way, trying to break new ground for women to ordain, to take the full ordination, where many people are against that still in monastic community. And so it's not easy. And yet he always gives me that trust, that respect, and that sense of confidence that it can be done and that it will be done in time. So this really helps us to be our best and to bring our best to the community that we dwell within. Like I said, even this conversation this morning, I think gave us all a lot of encouragement and inspiration. And who knows, maybe the taxi driver will now, actually his name is Kasim, and maybe he will take a little bit of time every day to meditate and just to see if he can make friends with his mind. That's how I explain the practice in brief, just getting to know our mind and what it needs and how to let it settle a little bit, how to see things with a bigger perspective and see how we can bring more kindness into our lives. So when I was looking into this whole topic, the question came up for me, I don't know if it's coming up for you yet, about the difference and maybe similarity between ethics and values. I really like to look into these things because I find it so interesting. And it seems to me that both ethics and values provide a kind of direction for our lives. They provide a kind of guidance and also a framework in a way, a kind of, I suppose, guidance as to how to relate and interact. And yet there's a slight difference between them. So as I was saying, ethics is more of a broader perspective. It's a broad framework that deals with questions of what is good and bad in terms of wholesome and unwholesome, beneficial and unbeneficial. And as I said earlier, this is the principle of actions of body, speech, and mind that lead to harm, that lead to suffering, or that lead to happiness and peace. And so these are ethically motivated. Yeah, you all must have heard of karma. Karma is not fate. It's not a kind of system of reward and punishment, but it is about ethical intention. And the Buddha said that whenever we have ethical intentions of non-greed, non-hate, and non-delusion, or if you want to frame that positively, you could say generosity, right? Non-greed, generosity, or giving, or letting go. Non-hate, loving kindness, compassion. Non-delusion, wisdom, clarity. That is a wholesome action. And that is going to lead to our own benefit and the benefit of others. Sometimes one of the difficult things in discerning this is that it doesn't necessarily lead to benefit immediately. We don't necessarily feel happy, even if we're coming from a wholesome place straight away. Yeah, we might still have all kinds of struggles in our lives. Things might not go well. We might look at people that are doing actions based on greed, hate, and delusion and think, how come they're not suffering? But when we start to understand our mind, we realize they must be suffering. It's not possible to be happy and simultaneously have thoughts and intentions of hate. It's just not possible. Yeah. At the very best, maybe you've numbed yourself to the effects, to the consequences. But that isn't living a happy and emotionally rich life. That's kind of more like psychopathy, actually, when we stop feeling and we stop being connected with the effects of our actions. So it involves some trust, because we're essentially planting seeds of loving kindness, generosity, goodwill. And over time, that will have consequences. And ethics is a kind of universal principle that applies throughout time, throughout culture. It exists, it remains true, whether a Buddha points to it or not. It's like a universal principle or law of nature, if you like. And values are similar, but they can be ethically aligned or less so. So values are kind of qualities or intentions that give some kind of life to our ethical conduct. So they, in a way, shape our priorities They shape what matters to us. They can be universal values, such as kindness, non-harm, or they can be deeply personal. You know, somebody may value kindness, compassion, social justice. They're kind of universal principles that lead to happiness. But there are other values like maybe competition. Is that a value? It can be, right? Comfort could be a value. Social approval could be a value. They're not necessarily ethical. To some extent, it depends how we go about it. But in another way, they might be downright unethical values as well. So our values really matter. Our ethics really matter too, because they shape the level or the quality of our lives. They shape how much meaning and satisfaction we're going to bring to our life and also experience in our life as well. And so these are really important questions to ask. You know, we can ask ourselves, what really matters to me? What am I really valuing in my life? And sometimes we're not putting our energy where our values are. Sometimes we say we value something, but then we don't actually give it the time it deserves. We don't make space for it in our lives. For example, peace. Do we value peace? You know, I would say I very much value peace and solitude, but I don't make that much time for solitude at this time. Our values can also change over time. So another interesting reflection is to ask yourself, you know, how have my values changed over time? And why, right? What have I learned along the way that's caused me to kind of adapt my value systems? One of mine, again related to the solitude, is that I think that was a higher priority in the past. And now the value that I'm living more from day to day is the value of service. It was always a strong value for me, but it's increased in importance. And also social justice. I don't often think of myself as a kind of, well, I do actually more and more think of myself as a kind of activist, but it wasn't intentional. It happened through life's experiences, through understanding how marginalization affects communities and individuals. And over time, I've been able to put a different language to what I do. And so those values have become quite predominant. But my old values are still there. It might be just a matter of shifting priorities. So we can really reflect on this, you know, what really matters to me and why? Have my values changed over time? And very importantly, are my values ethically aligned? How can I make them more so? You know, maybe ambition's not a bad thing necessarily. Even competition might not be. But how are we going about it? You know, are we disparaging other people? Are we taking more than our share? Are we happy to gain another person's loss? Or is it a kind of healthy way to see that we all bring out our best? So this is so important to reflect upon. And it relates to right speech as well. It relates to right speech. The Buddha said that speech is so important, so fundamental to, especially again, creating harmony in society, creating meaningful relationships, and healing division, that it has its own factor in the path. It's the third factor of the Eightfold Noble Path. The first factor being right view, which we talked about to some extent, reflecting on suffering and happiness, the causes of that, reflecting on the quality of our intentions, and from there developing wholesome intentions, developing intentions and attitudes of loving kindness, non-harm and generosity. And the very next factor is right speech. So these are directly informing the ways we communicate, the ways we speak through words, but even through silence, right? Speech and language happen in many ways. Sometimes a smile may be enough. It may be a very powerful form of expression. I think we started talking about that in the taxi as well, about how, you know, just smiling at a person usually brings a positive response, because a lot of the time people just have this sense of disconnect, or they have a sense of mistrust, depending on sometimes the media input that we're feeding our mind, right? We kind of have this particular view of the world, and then we kind of confirm it through the signs that we imagine we're being given. But if we actually decide, okay, I'm going to trust people, I'm going to trust that a smile is a positive thing, most of the time you'll find another person smiles back or relaxes. Sometimes they just ignore you, but who cares? It's good for you to smile. Doesn't it feel nice? I don't know. I think it's so important. So language is a very profound thing. It has a power to unite. It also has the power to divide and create a lot of conflict. And this is something that really rips community apart, even more so than differing ideologies. One of the biggest problems is divisive speech, or speech that is unkind and can lead to resentment, or speech that doesn't fully give another person the chance to be seen and to express themselves fully. In other words, quite often we come to decisions about people or situations without all the information, without really listening deeply. And I think that's also a part of right speech, being able to listen to another person. Even another person with views that you might find abhorrent. A friend of ours came to stay recently in our little bikini dwelling in Boars Hill, and she was talking about going on a, what kind of march was that? It was one of the justice ones. Do you remember? No, that's something else entirely. Yeah, Defend Our Juries, I think. Something like that. And I'm not quite sure. But anyway, she met somebody with very different views, and they were saying, immigrants are going to, rape our children. Aren't you bothered about our children's safety? And of course, these kind of views are just kind of heartbreaking to me to hear this kind of thing, as if unethical behavior belongs to a particular group of people. It's a human problem, right? But it was interesting because she said, in a way, she could see where they were coming from, but didn't know how to speak, didn't know how to reply. And I think quite often in that kind of situation, of course, we might not want to engage, but if we can try to find common ground and see that this person is actually, in a way, having values of safety, right? Their values are of safety, of wanting children to be safe, which is probably a shared value with the person that they're kind of, blaming in that case, persecuting even. And actually connect at that level. This is the realm of kind of activism and certainly, conflict resolution, and I'm not an expert in this. But sometimes just being able to hold an empathic space for another person to be heard may be the best way to de-escalate a situation. And so speech is not always the key. Sometimes just actually bringing out more in the person. So what do you mean by that? So what is it that you're afraid of? Yeah, of course, I agree with you. I also want my children to be safe, but is that really the problem? So it's a tricky area, and it's a very, an area that can become quickly inflamed. And this is why the principles of right speech are so very important. So how did the Buddha define right speech? And I'm probably going to talk for a little bit longer because there's so much to say, and then we'll have some meditation. Is everyone doing okay though? Yeah? Good. It's not too much. Good, very good. I just asked not as a self-deprecating thing, but just because it's important when we're talking about these things that it goes in. Sometimes too much information is, the problem, isn't it? We don't need more. So the Buddha talked about right speech not only in terms of, not lying or using harsh speech or divisive speech or frivolous speech, but also in how we speak. Okay, so he said there's this lovely framework of 5 principles. And the first is that truth should be timely. Yeah? Timely speech. So it's not always the right time to speak if somebody's already agitated, or just on a kind of bring it back to the home. Your partner or your friend has just walked in, they're tired, they're in a bad mood, they maybe have had a hard day at work. It's not the right time to bring something up or to try and give them feedback about something they're doing wrong. They already feel got at, and it might be better to speak in ways that calms them, that supports them. And when they're feeling relaxed, you can ask them, is now a good time? There's something I need to share, or I'd like to share. Is it a good time? Do you feel ready for that? So timely speech is crucial. And then also, of course, speech that is true. But speech should also be aimed at a person's benefit. I remember a few years ago getting a very, it was quite a sad letter actually from a very old friend who was basically saying that she felt that we were quite different from the people we used to be, and because of that she couldn't really share with me anymore. And she, in a sense, didn't want to be my friend anymore. And this is as an adult, right? So I kind of thought, wow, that's really sad, because we can be different, we can grow apart, but we can still share. We don't have to actually say, I don't want to be your friend anymore, We can just speak sometimes, but maybe less often. And one of the refrains she used in the letter many times was, I hope I'm not hurting you, but I just have to be honest. But I just have to be honest. And how many times is it? I was thinking to myself then, sometimes we use that as an excuse to actually say hurtful things. Oh, but I'm being honest. But is it really beneficial to say certain things? Or would it be more beneficial just to find a new way to relate to a person? We don't have to be so direct sometimes. And also, we don't have to say everything. Like in a monastery, we have this idea of giving feedback. And sometimes, especially new monastics, can be very overzealous. And it's like, I just need to tell you to clean something this way and not that way, or, the way that you ate was too noisy, and in the rules it says blah, blah, blah. And so people can feel that that's very important, but actually, is it really focused on things that are for our liberation? Is it really that important? Or should we be just pointing things out when they actually really lead to our higher good? So we don't have to point out every little thing to each other. So really ask yourself, is this going to be of benefit? And of course, that relates to when you speak. And the other two, which are really beautiful, are about speaking gently. Yeah? It doesn't mean that you have to skirt around the issue. It doesn't mean you don't firmly speak to injustice, or stand against hate. But you do it in a way that's gentle and not defiled, not full of anger, not in a way that's going to inflame a situation. Yeah? And then lastly, to speak from a mind of loving kindness. So to really check with your intentions. An example of this, I guess, is, a worldly example is you're in a meeting and there's a colleague kind of speaking on your behalf and misrepresenting you, maybe saying something that isn't true about your work or about your intention, and you have this sense that I really need to correct them, I really need to be right. But sometimes the value you might want to bring to that interaction is actually the value of harmony or the value of restraint. And maybe it would make more sense to wait until after the meeting and then to approach the person. You can still give correction. You can still say, maybe there was a misunderstanding here. What I actually meant was this. What I'm actually trying to do is this. And I just want you to, make that known. And then that will preserve that person's dignity. It will prevent resentment arising. And in a way, you're practicing the value of truth, but in a way that's restrained. Yeah? So there's different ways we can approach situations. Even the other day, I think I approached you about something, didn't I? That something in the dynamic was a little bit strange. And, it was tempting to say something then and there, but I was like, no, nobody's doing anything actually wrong out of any bad intention. But I just feel a little bit strange about this. So I approached you afterwards at a time when we were both very calm. And it was actually quite helpful because it's something we can both work on. So it's for our benefit as well. So in this way, we can, bring our values to the way we speak. I remember when we had someone staying with us in the old Vihara, and it was the first time they stayed in a monastery, and they said to me, wow, just from being around people and observing the way that you're all speaking kindly, with a lot of generosity, not kind of coming to wrong assumptions about each other, just from being around that, I've noticed that my own speech has sort of become elevated. I'm much more careful about the way I speak and the way I use my language. And it's just from being in community. So it's really important to surround ourselves with people who share similar ethics and similar values and who can bring out the best in us. I did want to also draw on a little sutta that may surprise people, because sometimes people think that right speech in Buddhism is always about saying something pleasant, not getting into disputes, not really calling out bad behavior, but actually the Buddha said the opposite. So there's a little sutta where he says that he's talking about heaven and hell, okay, so you could take that figuratively, you could take that as a real place, but I often take this as kind of a mental state. And he says, basically, a person who, without investigating and scrutinizing, praises something that merits blame is brought to hell as if deposited there. In other words, you shouldn't be praising something that deserves blame. Another person, without investigating and scrutinizing, blames something that deserves praise. And the similar problem, it's not going to have wholesome results. I think the third one was something like one without investigating and scrutinizing suspects a matter that merits trust. And the other way around as well, trusts something that actually merits suspicion. So we have to use our discernment and wisdom, and sometimes we have to blame what's worthy of blame. Right? This is often tricky in Buddhist communities if a person's ethical understanding is, I would say, not quite mature and feels that you should always say positive things about absolutely everybody, otherwise it's wrong speech. Sometimes a person's behavior is off and we need to be able to point that out. But the Buddha gives clear guidelines for that. He says we don't criticize the person, we criticize the behavior. And again, using these 5 principles, is it timely? Is it for the person's benefit? Is it true? Is it gentle? Is it with a mind of loving kindness? Yeah. So instead of saying, all those people who behave in this and this way are just creating suffering, instead of that, we point to principles of Dhamma. So we say, when people behave from greed, hate and delusion, it leads to suffering. Oh no, sorry, not even people. Action motivated by greed, hate and delusion causes suffering. You take the people out of it. You don't blame people, you talk about Dhamma principles. There was an example from the suttas about the Buddha's advice to King Pasenadi, who was ruling over, I can't remember which kingdom it was at the time, but there were lots of different kind of mini countries in India in the Buddha's day. And instead of criticizing the king about the way he was ruling, like any king who wants power, he just spoke from principles. So he said to the king, "Great king, when rulers are unjust, the people become fearful. The country becomes unstable and suffering increases. When a leader or king is righteous, people prosper and live without fear." So again, this wasn't a personal kind of telling off. He was pointing to something that is true in reality. It's a reality that if we rule in an unjust way, people will become afraid. And if people are afraid, they won't be able to function well. The place will become unstable. People will start fighting each other. And it's in nobody's interest. So he was appealing to his sense of responsibility and pointing out how self-defeating any kind of violence is. And so when we do this, people don't get on the defense. We manage to relate to them in a way that they can understand what is in their own best interest. And we're not kind of pitching one set of people against another. But this takes so much practice, and it also takes quite a lot of reflection on non-self, that our behaviours, our patterns of being and showing up in the world are conditioned. You know, they're not, in a sense, our fault. They are our responsibility, but we're conditioned. We're doing the best we can with the influences around us, the ways we've learned, the ways we've behaved in the past, the way we've observed other people behave, etc., etc. And sometimes we need to be that positive influence for somebody else. So not only do we express our values through our speech, we can also help other people develop better values. And another example in the suttas is the example of Angulimala. Does anybody know Angulimala? Yeah, some of you will. So he was a mass murderer. And apparently he was okay before, but then he got caught up with the wrong teacher. So be very aware of what I say today, okay? But this teacher actually suggested that out of devotion he should go and kill 1,000 people, and as a proof to the teacher he should bring back their little finger to show how many people he killed. So this person was called Angulimala because he had a anguli, which is like a necklace of fingers. Oh no, the mala is the necklace, the anguli is the finger. He had a necklace of fingers around his neck. Anyway, the story goes that the Buddha found out that he was doing this, and out of compassion came to him and said basically a couple of words. First of all, he, through his psychic powers, he made himself walk really, really fast so that the murderer couldn't catch up with him. So he used these psychic powers so that he appeared he was walking at a normal speed, but actually he was walking really fast. And Angulimala was like, "What?" And he started shouting after the Buddha, "Stop, recluse, stop." And the Buddha at that point turned around and he said, "Angulimala, you stop. I've already stopped." And of course that didn't mean he'd physically stopped. It meant he'd stopped doing all those unwholesome things. You stop too. So he didn't criticize Angulimala. He didn't say, "You stupid person, how can you do this?" He didn't fight him. He didn't even reprove him. He simply said, "I've stopped, you stop too." And if you think about it, that's incredibly skillful. It was firm. He was speaking from truth, but he was also speaking in a way that he could relate to the Buddha. The Buddha wasn't pitching himself above Angulimala. So he was kind of appealing to his sense of humanity that we all share. And because of that, it was effective. And Angulimala actually transformed his whole life. His entire value system changed. And instead of continuing to harm beings, he turned into the patron saint for pregnant women and actually helped women deliver children. And one of the things he used to say when they were delivering the children, he used to tell them that since my birth, I have never harmed or hurt a living being. And by the power of this truth, may your pregnancy be successful. May the child be born and thrive. And somebody heard him saying this and they said, "How can you say that? You've killed 1,000 beings." And it's like, no, since my birth in the Dhamma, since my noble birth, because he actually became enlightened, I've never killed or harmed a living being. And the power of that truth from such a person who had completely transformed his life meant that he was very successful and the childbirth went smoothly. So there you go. He gave life instead of taking life to many living beings. So I can see that I have too much to say as usual, but I did want to just say about how to bring this into the greater community. And again, one of the ways the Buddha talked about it, and one of the importance of shared values, is not that everybody thinks the same or that everybody is the same, but that our ethical values are aligned. And then we bring our own unique qualities into our communities. Some people might want to do social justice activism. Some people might be involved in, non-violent communication. Some people might be doctors. Some people might be bus drivers. Some people might be monastics. We all have our skills and our inclinations. And there's a lovely sutta in the Majjhima Nikaya, I forget the number, called the Gosingasala Sutta. And it was a time that many monastics came together to answer a question posed by a senior monk. And the question was, what kind of monastic would light up this forest? And it was really beautiful because each person spoke from their own perspective about the kind of qualities that would light up the forest in the night under the full moon. And some people said the kind of person that would light up this forest is a person who delights in solitude, who delights in serenity of mind and meditation. The next person said the kind of person that would light up the forest is a person who remembers well whatever they've learned and can repeat the Buddha's teachings as if by memory. Another person said the kind of person that would light up this forest is a person who lives with little, who is austere and who sleeps outdoors and wears only basic robes. Another person said the kind of person that would light up the forest is a person who teaches and instructs and inspires other monastics. And the Buddha said, when he came to know about this conversation, that everybody was correct. Because the person saying that, a person who delights in meditation was speaking what was true for them. That person delighted themselves in meditation, so for them it was correct to say that. So this points to integrity, doesn't it? To actually living what our highest values are, and to the fact that that will be different for different people. But when we can come together in harmony, we can learn from one another, then our communities, our societies become richly diverse. We can learn from one another. And again, that's what the taxi driver was saying. His mum had always said that the purpose of difference is to ponder and to learn from one another, to enrich ourselves as human beings. We can't do this alone. We're not going to be able to do this alone. There's so much instability in the world. There's so much conflict and division. It's impossible to thrive alone. I think now more than ever, we need to develop harmonious communities. That might just be at the level of family, but it also can be in a community like this, who come together just for a day. But then we can take out what we learn to our own social communities, to our colleagues, maybe to the government, maybe to in the political forum. We can, we can seek to change at that level, whatever it is that we do. And, sharing beautiful values, reflecting on them often is a vital part of this. Also reflecting on our own conduct, reflecting that just as all beings want happiness and recoil from pain, so just as I do, so do all beings. These are universal wishes. And it's said that not only do we practice our ethical conduct carefully, we also should inspire others to do the same. We should speak in praise of harmlessness, in praise of whatever ethical values you hold dear, and also encourage other people to practice them. Yeah. So this is how we can use our speech to inspire. And such beautiful values, such wise speech, can transform a murderer into a patron saint. Kind speech can heal division and create incredible harmony, and create incredible spaces where we can learn, where we can practice, and most of all, where we can develop our meditation to our highest spiritual potential. So this is the topic for today, and I hope there's something beneficial for all of you here. So now we shall have a little break, and then perhaps we'll do some meditation. Yeah? Okay.